Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'll try to make this a little bit more livelier as much as possible. I think one of the big things about when we talk about modern threat intelligence is that we always talk about the same thing over and over again. Whether it's the noise, everything we buy is a bunch of security theater, the level of knowledge expertise, and the priorities that our customers and everyone is dealing with on top of everything that you're doing, as well as the constant work that is driven, built by a lot of our IT, and as we go through a lot of digitization and what have you. And in today's world, what we see is that there are so many data sets, and everybody has this idea that all of this data is just readily available, and which is what we call the commodity versus what's actually real. Think of like threat intelligence as like almost like an insider trading platform, and that's what we need to have a mindset. I know that's not probably a legal way to say certain things, but that's one of the big problems that we deal with. Because one of the big problems we have is that we often talk about threat intelligence, brand reputation, all of these combined together, but the reality is, if it works, why are we still getting breached? It's a constant thing that we deal with. So to start off, we want to level set, and just making sure. One of the big things is also the terminology, understanding what it actually means to different people. Well, it means different things to a lot of different people in many ways. Whether it's a source of data, how we handle the data. We often get a lot of requests saying, hey, let's just get the IOCs and the TTPs and IPs, and it's like it has no meaning to what actual threat intelligence really means. And of course, one of the big part is actually using the information to reduce the risk to the company. Because it's not just about identifying and talking about these technical jargons, but it's also about understanding what you can do to reduce it. Because you have to understand how this all benefits what a fusion center really is. We often talk about, and I say we, I'm talking about our customers, the people that I speak with, in a lot of the conferences I conduct and explaining things. Dark web means different things to many people. It's a simple way I would tell people is like it's a scraper. It scrapes information from Tor sites and various forums and sources where it pulls information for analytics, collecting, and all this kind of stuff. But the threat intelligence data, there's a lot of usage. What we see is that we often see cybersecurity team or information security, vulnerability. But it's not just about them. We could also use it for fraud. We could use it for, threats. And when I say threats, I don't mean like, there is a ransomware group or there's a bad, 0 days. We're actually talking about ingesting not just one set of data, but operation and functional data that can be used for different purposes. And the other main component is, it's actually to help fight crimes, not just from a, commercial cybersecurity team defending against the bad guys, but it can also be used by military, law enforcement to better understand and collect information and process those intelligence to actually combat crimes as well. Because we have this, in the past when I do a lot of board of directors conversation, we often talk about if not when, those kind of things. Whereas now it's kind of like, are we being targeted? Do we have a material breach? What I would suggest to everybody is that we need to focus on it a little differently. It's what we call the finite versus infinite game theory. What that means is that there's no winning or losing in what we're dealing with. It's just, we're not talking about a warfare. We're not talking about war to, kinetic warfare, all this stuff. We're talking about the fact that as long as there are patches, as long as there are things that's going to be used for monetization or can enable criminal activity, this constant battle, I don't want to say battle, this constant game that we play with the bad guys is just not going to stop. And again, it doesn't matter how much you invest. It doesn't matter what you do. At the end of the day, you're still going to deal with the fact that there's going to be outside forces that wants what you have. And it's just the normal thing that we're going to deal with. And each of these data in the dark web, they come from various different layers, and it means different things as you go down the list. So whether you're talking about peer-to-peer, forums, dark web, open web, all these Tor sites, they all live in a different way and different way we actually collect the information. how useful it is for everybody, it is a lot of data you're dealing with, and unfortunately or fortunately, you're talking about information that needs to be collected, aggregated, and normalized so that you have to have a standard operating procedure to how to handle this data. More often than not, a lot of our peers, we have a platform that allows you to do all these things, and we do that for you. But you also need to take into account, as you're thinking about Fusion Center and how to build this threat intelligence, that you need to be able to document all these different things. Because one of the big components of Fusion Center is that you have to have or capabilities where you could have unstructured data into a structured format. Forget about AI, ML, that's a whole different conversation. But the key thing about Fusion Center is normalizing the data from an ETL process to make sure that it can be used and normalized before anything can happen. Because all of these things has to be set up in advance. And again, all of these data has to be handled very uniquely. When you're talking about consuming this data to actually understanding where all these components fit, they don't actually all map together. So imagine you got 30, 40, 50,000 different sources, whether it's your financial transaction, your mobile app data, your authentication data, your customer data, all of this stuff without understanding what those things are, you're not going to understand how to map it together. Hence why when we talk about handling of the data, we're not just talking about what it happens when you actually grab the data, but how do you protect the data in the same way as of a database as well. Most important thing about as you're thinking about modernizing your threat intelligence, looking at metrics, well, let me rephrase this. You have to have a metrics. Nothing is going to happen without understanding that there has to be an output that can be measurable. Because one of the big conversation is always been, the thing that people always ask is trying to understand how to use the Fusion Center to detect predictive analytics of potential future events from happening. The short answer is that would be great, and if somebody could do that, I'll give them $100. But the reality is that's never going to happen because everything is very opportunistic. I would say 98% of the events that you're going to see is all opportunistic. It's not targeted or nation state or sophistication. Because if you're able to see that, it's already has happened 6 months prior, and you're just following up on what's already happened. One of the big things about Fusion Center is actually being able to cause friction. I always tell people this is not about blocking them, but slowing them down. Even when we're fighting against the cyber criminals or adversaries or what have you, our main goal is not to disrupt the environment, because when you disrupt the environment, they just pop right up and start again. I don't know how many times people have to ask me, we need to track the command and control server. I'm like, great, what are you going to do with it? Well, we want to shut it down. Okay, and then what? It's the same thing, like we want to track the attacker's IP address. Okay, so what are you going to do? Are you a law enforcement? Are you a Ministry of Interior, Ministry of Defense? We have to get realistic about what we're trying to do. And the key is that we need to start understanding that this is, again, infinity game. And also this is about disrupting their capability and the speed and agility of what's happening. So the key thing is that when you're looking, so when we talk about threat intelligence, Fusion Center, all these terminologies, let's just get to the basics. The core component of Fusion Center is to reduce risk. Identify a way in which you're going to be able to create risk reduction for your environment. And it's about being able to not only understand it from a cyber perspective, but also from business perspective. We spend more time actually working with customers on the different parts of the departments, and to understand from an enterprise risk, to enable business, to expand their business, and also help them grow from a digitalization perspective. Because at the end of the day, information security, cybersecurity is ancillary. We're peripheral, and that's just the reality of it, right? Where you don't have enough time, resource, and money to support everything that happens. So it is in our best interest to identify those risks using the data as kind of the circle of life or golden eye, and to be able to utilize this information to actually identify ways to reduce risk. And it doesn't mean that you have to be an engineer, artificial, all this stuff. You just need to understand that with data, you're just trying to reduce risk at the end of the day. So I think, again, one of the big value proposition when you're talking about threat intelligence is obviously it's help aid in what you're doing to reduce it and automate it as much as possible. Automation and orchestration is a common thematic thing. We say it over and over again, but it is true. We have so much data, we have to have those mechanisms in order to actually help reduce the burden on the resource as well. And we talk about this over and over again, right? Let's be proactive versus reactive. When it is true, you can be much more proactive when you have all these data points from both business and technology and security to actually understand where these frictions are happening and to reduce those points as well. And the third point is kind of important because one of the big things that we get a lot is, we saw this on the dark web. Is this real? Well, I'll be the first one to say, if you see it in the dark web, if you see it in the social media, the world is not ending. It ended 3 months ago. So this is a marketplace that has been sold over and over again. And let me take a step back. When things get stolen, or when you're breached, when you're compromised, when your environment has been botted, or you got a command control system that's communicating back and forth, even though you may think your telemetry has identified it, the initial access broker who's going to grab all that information, artifacts from your machine, and they're going to sell it at the highest bidder. Between the time you're compromised to the time when it's on the dark web, you're looking at 3 to 6 months of time that these people have used this data over and over and over before actually you recognizing it. And that is the truth, and we often see this number of times. So when you're looking at dark web or information on social media, you're already behind the curve, but don't react to it. Now start triaging this information. You have your disaster recovery, BCP, playbooks on all this thing. Like, don't react immediately. Just try to understand, like, you have an event and try to go through this as slow as possible. And part of this Fusion Center, by having this data collection, is going to allow you to able to understand where all these data points came from to make your life easier. So in the historical way, we always talked about, there's a lot of security operations center technology, SOC, and everything else. I always tell people, like, look, that's the old way. We have to really look at it from what is a real Fusion Center. And the main difference is between centralized versus unified. Because when you're talking about unification, you're not just talking about security engineers working on their little computers with a big screen, right? We're talking about bringing in all the right individuals, whether it's physical security, risk management, and collaborating and partnering together to have a common goal. And what I mean by that is, the traditional way, in the modern warfight, we're talking about, what to do with these advanced adversary threats and everything else. And what we're talking about is going back to the very simple things. What is the mission of the group versus a function? Because traditionally, Security Operations Center was a very functional team within an organization under information security. Unified versus centralized. Security Operations Center, back 15, 20 years ago, we talked about it, centralized logging and all of this thing. No, we need to think of it as a unified view for the organization, which goes far beyond just, endpoint, network, all this stuff. You have to bring in the business and other analytics information to actually make it work. The most important thing, purpose versus focus. Don't have the thing that horses have. You have to have a focus as to what you're trying to do. And focus doesn't mean we're going to defend our network from, nation state. That's not really a focus. Focus is to protect the business, enable business. So, a lot of terminologies I went through. Lots of information about what we should do with the data. The key messaging is really on mitigating risks and also understanding the benefits. The core benefit being that this is a way for you to unify, have a mission-oriented focus to protect business. And in conclusion, there's a lot of things you could do. We have a lot of tools. The problem is we have too many tools. Every tool does 10 different things, and you have 7 different layers and endpoint. But before you start adding more stack, look at all your information and logging and business and data and then try triaging those together. See what you actually get out of it first, and then start adding where the missing pieces are. I think once you start when you start deciphering this code of data, I think you're going to see why fusion center is the way a lot of people are going. We have this special program. I heard about a GoldenEye crystal ball, and that is just exactly what it is to understand from data to what's happening in your environment. And yes, many company has done it, but key messaging is it's not a product. It's people, process, and technology. And it's not a solution you could just buy to make magic happen, because then you're going to have more stuff to learn anyways. But it's been done many times over. You don't need a lot of maturity to do it. The key is understanding an inventory of everything that you own so that you make your life easier. And of course, ending it with Bloomberg Terminal, my favorite in the world. I don't trade stocks, but like this is the first thing I learned back in 1993 about what a Bloomberg Terminal is. And to this day, I try to mimic this model. This is not about having a single pane glass. It's about understanding where the data is coming from and actually making sense out of it. Thank you.